it felt worse than having my legs blown off because it was so personal. It was very about me. It just felt like somebody had said, "No thanks, Harry, we don't like you."
Hi, and welcome to Write Off, a podcast about writing rejection and how people get through it. I'm Francesca Steele, a journalist and writer based in London. Writing rejection has been a subject close to my heart ever since I didn't manage to sell my first book last year. If you're interested, you can hear a little bit more about that in the first episode in this series and in the trailer. My guest this week is Harry Parker, a writer and artist who had a really interesting route to publication. Harry is an army veteran who, as you can hear from that intro, lost his legs following an IED explosion while on tour in Afghanistan. Several years later, back in the UK, Harry wrote a novel, Anatomy of a Soldier, which tells the story of Sergeant Tom Barnes, who also loses his legs in an explosion, through the perspective of 45 inanimate objects: a gun, a bag of fertiliser, a prosthetic leg, a grieving mother's handbag. It's an extraordinary book, disorienting, unusual and incredibly moving. And in 2016, when it was published, Harry was featured as one of the Observer's New Faces of Fiction. The book got rave reviews and won the Waverton Good Read Award the following year. Overall, a pretty incredible experience for a debut novelist. But his second book did not go so well. It didn't sell, and Harry, who is clearly an extremely resilient guy, is nonetheless very candid here about how personal that rejection felt and how hard it's been to get over. It's a great reminder, I think, that writing success is not linear, even for established authors. You have to be prepared for bumps in the road and allow yourself time to accommodate them. I'm really grateful to Harry for speaking so honestly about what that was like. You can find Anatomy of a Soldier and books by my other guests at my online bookstore. The link is uk.bookshop.org/shop/Francesca Steele. So here's Harry.
Yeah, so I was in the army before I was injured for about 3 or 4 years. And then I was injured in Afghanistan. I lost both my legs and then went into the sort of quite long rehabilitation process, which took about a year, maybe a year and a half, sort of physical rehab. The sort of coming to terms mentally is, it's hard to define how long it takes. But probably about 2 to 3 years until you sort of feel like you're yourself again. I worked in the Foreign Office and in Whitehall and did all sorts of other things. I suppose it was about 7 years after I was injured maybe 6 years, that I started to write. First, actually, I started painting, but I couldn't really say what I wanted to say painting. And I should probably say I went to art school before I was in the army. Sort of, it's what I always wanted to do, be an artist, but sort of ended up in the army. And then, I started writing, and I was still working in the Foreign Office, sort of writing in my lunch break. And my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, said, you should just quit that job and write the book. So that's what I did. I quit the Foreign Office. I gave myself sort of 3 months to write it before the sort of money ran out, and I sort of had to find a proper job again. And that's sort of how I came to write it.
So actually that writing of it was quite fast. I guess at that stage you'd been mulling it over for quite a while.
Yes, I think having tried writing a few times now, having it I had it pretty much in my head. I think it helps when it's based on something that's quite autobiographical, although for me the book is fiction. I think for almost anyone else who reads it, they read it as sort of autobiographical fiction. But I very much in my imagination turned things around and made it a sort of creative endeavor as much as possible, which I think allowed me to do it. So I think, having it all in my imagination almost before I even started writing really helped for it then to just sort of splurge out. And it did come out quickly. It took me about 12 weeks to write it. And then sort of editing took a bit longer than that, obviously, and the whole process of getting it published obviously much longer. But it was quick. It was quick.
It's such a brilliant and unusual and powerful book. I've never really read anything else like it, and it obviously, because in part narrates the story of both the soldier and the insurgents from the point of view of various objects.
I think for me, the hardest one to read about, and in a way the most powerful, was the oscillating saw, which performs the amputation that removes Tom's second leg. And it's a funny one because it's both extremely visceral and emotional, and yet also kind of detached because the narrators aren't people. I was just wondering which for you were the most memorable or satisfying objects to write.
Yeah, it feels a long time ago now, and it almost feels like somebody else wrote it in a way. But I think the ones that I enjoyed writing most were actually the ones like, for instance, the Persian rug, which it was sort of something about writing from the point of view of an object that could be made. You could sort of tell the story of that and then moves around the world. You could sort of, I just really enjoyed how you could play around with this narrative point of view where it was slightly detached and emotional, but somehow you could connect different people and different stories in quite a sort of interesting way. And I really enjoyed that sort of creative challenge of sort of, using this weird point of view and what you could do with it to basically tell stories. Yeah.
I read somewhere that your wife initially told you that the idea of writing it in that way sounded potentially a bit gimmicky. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think, there's still people, I know there's people who find it gimmicky. And I think had I been to any writing courses, I never would have written this book like I did, because I think the first rule of all writing courses is never write from the point of view of an object, because it's gimmicky.
It's funny you say that, because I did a writer's course at Faber Academy and we used an extract from your book as one of the examples, but I guess that was after publication.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they published the book, so they probably
exactly.
a bit biased. But no, I sort of know it's a strange way of writing, and it's very, we all have different imaginations and we see the world very differently. And this is definitely sort of suits my imagination and the way I thought about it. There's lots of reasons I did it, the detachment, the way I could be creative with it, the way I could sort of write something that was very personal and have some distance from it, helped. But also I think for me it made it more powerful. That won't be the case for everyone, but the distance somehow for me creates more impact, I think.
Yes, I think that's right. It reminded me in some ways, although it is wholly of itself really, but it reminded me in some ways of sometimes when you read from the perspective of a small child, where there's a kind of comprehensive way of viewing things, but there's also a kind of helplessness.
There was times when I fiddled around with how much sort of objects know, if that makes sense, because they don't really have personality. They're sort of points of experience, but it does sort of start to creep in that the objects sort of have a sense of how the characters might be feeling or some of their sort of internal world. And I think that was all quite interesting for me, how sort of abstract it could be. But it's playing around with those things is always a fun way of writing it.
And so was it fun to write that 3 months in particular that you took off? Was it a very enjoyable experience? Because, I mean, you said you were an artist before that, but this was entirely new, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I did a literary event that I remember quite clearly, and there was a woman in the front row who sort of said, she sort of said, you've got PTSD, haven't you? And this is your therapy. And I had to explain that I didn't have PTSD, which is quite hard for some people to realise when that even though you've had both legs blown off in a conflict, you might not have PTSD. And that she was adamant that this was my therapy. And at the time, I was very, I was very adamant myself that this wasn't therapy; it was purely a creative thing, and that's how it felt at the time. I wasn't sort of exercising my demons or anything like that. But actually, looking back with a bit more perspective, although it wasn't therapy, having written a few books now, I think whenever you write a book, you pour so much into it that there's an element of sort of catharsis just printing out 90,000 words on a printer for the first time, and that's one of the most amazing moments. And there's something quite cathartic about that, whether it's complete fiction or something that's completely autobiographical, because you really do lay yourself bare in any writing. And so I might, if she asked me the question again, I might be a little bit more tempered in telling her that it definitely wasn't therapy, but at the time it definitely felt like a creative, fun thing to do. And I was really having fun writing it. It was really, I love being creative, and that's why what gave me the biggest kick out of it, really.
So you wrote it, you edited it, and then did you quickly find an agent? What was the process after that?
I was really lucky. I got offered by a couple of agents who were willing to take it on, and then I was really lucky. I had quite a difficult choice to make.
And then it was, it was critically acclaimed. It was extremely well reviewed. You were included in The Observer's New Faces of Fiction in 2016. What was that publishing process like for you? And how did all that acclaim feel once the book was actually out? And one of the reasons I wanted to ask that, I mean, it's interesting for everyone, but there's actually a heartbreaking bit in the book where Tom is back home and cries and worries that everyone is now looking at him because he's an amputee, and that suddenly sort of hits home, I guess. Is that how you felt recovering from your injuries? And then was there a kind of different version of that sort of sense of being stared at in a different way as a celebrated debut author? I don't know if that's a weird conflating of things, but...
It's a very good observation. And I think, we can be lots of different people at once, I think. And I'm definitely an introvert and I don't really like being the center of attention. But yet I'd written this book. And it's a strange thing about writing, is that you can sit on your own for months and months and months and write something. And then because of the market and the way it works, you have to then go and sell it. But I'd sort of accepted that was part of it. And actually, for lots of reasons, although I'm a bit of an introvert, I'm quite lucky. I don't mind too much standing on a stage and talking about it. And I think the sort of critical acclaim and things like that, I wouldn't go that far, but it's actually, we all dream of, anyone who's ever sat down to write a book, if they have an imagination, is always potentially imagining what it might be like to be reviewed and have a good review and maybe win a prize and all those things. I think that's human nature. It certainly was for me. So when parts of it start to come true, it is odd, and also it's different. Even what I found was even a good review was quite exposing, because I was lucky that most of the reviews I had were very positive. I mean, the first review I had was actually a real panning, which was quite worrying, because I thought, oh God, I'm in for a load of really bad reviews. But actually, on the whole, I was very lucky with the reviews I had and how widely it was reviewed. But even so, I would read them and I'd sort of throw them down on the table, and my wife would then pick it up and read it and say, why have you thrown it on the table? It's pretty good. And for some reason, I found that even I would sort of read the bits that weren't, that didn't see it the way I saw it, and had taken something that I didn't feel true about the book, even though overall they were positive. So, and since then, and having had other experiences of writing, actually just being reviewed at all, it's pretty cool. No matter what the review is, just the thought that anyone's even listening is half the battle.
So then you started work on a second book, which I recall from another podcast at the time is not from the point of view of objects.
Yeah, so I've started, like I'm sure lots of people, I've started a lot of books, a lot of projects. There was a book that I was writing almost as soon as I finished. It was burning very brightly in my imagination. Almost as soon as I finished Anatomy of a Soldier, and it was very, it was very alive for me, and I wrote it and it was not a very long book, but it took, I was writing it and I thought it was the best book that had ever been written. And it turned out that it was far from that. I think I was just probably too close to it. But yeah, I wrote that over about a year, I suppose, and then rewrote it a number of times for in the sort of dialogue with my agent, and then sent it to a publisher, and they said, actually, this is not good and this is a bit broken, this book, and we're not sure how you can fix it. And then now I'm actually writing another book, which is non-fiction, and that's for the Welcome Collection, which is a very different book, and it's about something very different. And then there's a few small projects along the way. I've tried a few children's books because I draw as well, and those two, although they've got to publishers and have sort of been put around, they've never been sort of taken up. So you sort of start to, I think, starting with a success like I did is probably more unusual than sort of having to work a bit harder for it. And then having a few years of not having success has been, I'll admit, it's been very hard to take at times, and really changes your sort of your outlook on what you do, essentially.
Yes. Let's go back to that second book, if that's all right. What was that about?
I almost don't want to talk about it. So it was about, oh God, it's so hard to talk about now. It was about a man who walked into Westminster and set himself on fire, and it as a sort of protest. That's the very start, and then the whole book is about this hospital who is trying to look after this very burnt man while the world slightly falls apart because of the riots that are going on outside. The idea was the Arab Spring comes to London, and it was quite a sort of strange, meant to be a sort of quite strange little book, not too long, almost a novella. And I although I still believe the idea is okay, I couldn't pull it off in a narrative sense, if that makes sense. I couldn't make it work. And I can see that now, and it was sort of overwritten, and I thought I was better than I was, and all that sort of stuff. But that was the story.
And had you agreed that story or something like that with your agent before you started writing, or was it just kind of you on your own creating it and then giving it to your agent once you'd done a first draft?
I think I was the one very much, it was my idea. And although I talked to my agent and an editor at Faber who'd edited the first book, and they were into the idea, and they were sort of enthusiastic, of course, that, they could only be supportive of me. It wasn't like they were saying, yeah, this is great, we should definitely publish this and things. It was, and it's always much more grown up than that. No one's gonna, unless you're one of the 1% household name writers out there, very few publishers are going to take any risk on someone who isn't that, on an idea they've got, if that makes sense. Yes.
And then so you redrafted a bunch of times, and then you sent it out, or your agent sent it out to publishers, and then what happened? I know you sort of said, but was it a long period of time of people coming back and saying no, or?
No, actually, I only sent it to one publisher, and the publisher had published my book. And I think the response and chatting to my agent made me realise that I shouldn't send it out any further. So it wasn't that long. It was just the length of time it took the editor at Faber to read it. And I think the reason I didn't send it out wider was because he said he'd had an author who'd won, the biggest prizes out there, and then had written a book that wasn't very well reviewed. And his advice was that I shouldn't publish. Essentially, it felt like, you shouldn't publish this book, it's not good enough, you can do better, I think was the sort of advice. And I sort of took me a bit of time and a lot of anger to sort of get around that, because I think, the thing about writing a novel or even non-fiction, which I'm now doing, is that you're really laying yourself bare. And when somebody says, oh, actually, this book's not for us, we don't think it's quite good enough, what you hear as an author is, you're not quite good enough, and you're not for us. Because it feels so personal. It's a sort of, well, that's how it felt to me. Should I say it? It becomes you, even if it's fiction, because it is you. You've created it out of nothing, and I think that's why it's hard to take. If that makes sense. I mean, I don't know what you think, Francesca.
Yes, I mean, I agree, and I think it's so interesting to hear the way that you were sort of given this career advice in that way, because I think when you start writing, and this is maybe a good thing in some ways, you don't think of the career trajectory, you think about what you're writing. But actually, when someone turns around and says, this isn't your best work, you can do better, I mean, that's a compliment, really, but it would be hard not to hear that as the opposite at the time.
Yeah, I think especially when you've just spent a year on it and then a year rewriting it, thinking you can fix it. So actually, there were lots of lessons I learned, fail earlier. If you have that relationship with an editor or an agent, which not everyone will, especially if they're starting out, get it to them sooner, really work in dialogue. Fail early is so important. Don't keep hammering at something that isn't good enough. I mean, talking about the career thing, I was employed in the army, which has a very structured career progression. You sort of know which courses you have to do and who you have to suck up to, and how to get promoted. And it's pretty clear when you're not good enough to get promoted, and that's you. And I think that's probably a little bit easier to accept. But if you work in a creative industry, it's not like that. It's not linear. It's much more up and down. I think it's much more fluid, and you could be very successful for a few years and then spend 5 years not being successful at all, and then become successful again. I think all those things can happen. For me, I think that part of being creative is both really liberating and freeing, but also it creates a lot of uncertainty, especially when you have responsibilities and a family and things like that. So yeah, I think the career thing is interesting, and having advice and realizing that you're not just on your own is important, but it's not the case for everyone. I mean, at the end of the day, it is just you sitting at your computer trying to create something out of nothing.
Yes. Did you learn anything about the craft of writing from that experience of writing the second book?
Yeah, I mean, I learned so much, and actually the line by line writing is I would say is significantly better than my first book. I think you can become a bit knowing as well, though. You have to be a bit careful. There's something about debuts that when they're not too sort of, almost when you haven't read too much, so there can be something so quite immediate and powerful about that too. But in terms of the craft of writing, I learned a huge amount, and actually I now know that it wasn't dead time either. There's lots of things in it that might come back, or the whole thing might come back in a different way or different form, different medium. So you've got to be robust, I think. But God, it is really tough because when you're sitting writing a book, the day-to-day experience of it for me is, 1 minute I'm thinking it's the worst thing that's ever been written and it's crap and I can't fix it and no one's ever going to want to read it. And the next day, I think I'm going to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, which is obviously ridiculous, but it does. And sod it, I can admit that, but it does swing between these two polar extremes. And I think for me, that's my sort of experience of it. And also why, just by in the sort of actual craft of writing, half the time what I write is crap, but it's only through editing and rereading and editing and rewriting that I get anywhere near anything which is good enough, I think.
Yeah. What was predominantly wrong with that manuscript, if you're able to kind of pinpoint one thing that would be helpful to listeners? Was there something that you learned like not to do again?
Yes. So don't write unless you're the best writer in the world. I wouldn't advise writing from the point of view of a coward.
That's so interesting.
Because no one, it's very hard to empathize with a coward. And what we want in stories is transformation, probably. Most of us want a transformation of some kind. And so the transformation in my book went from someone who was a coward to someone who was no longer a coward. And in the story I was writing, the narrative drive and that transformation was just too weak, basically. And trying to fix that, in 12 rewrites just didn't work. So although there are bits about the book that I think are good enough, there's too much of it that doesn't grip the reader,
Does it feel sad to put that book aside, even though, as you've said, maybe it will come back? I mean, I know I find the thought of leaving characters behind and not sort of giving them life, as it were, very sad. What
was sad for me was that when I was finishing Anatomy of a Soldier, I thought, this is before it was even published, this is as I was writing it, there were so many different ideas I had that felt good. And I thought, I can write this book, and then I can write this book, and then I can write this book. And, the biggest shame for me was that I set out on this second book that didn't work. And all those ideas just wilted and died. I lost the confidence to write them anymore, because I felt that if this idea that had burned so bright, if I couldn't pull off this idea that burned so bright, why would I ever write another book? How can I start again? Because it's such an effort, isn't it? It's like climbing Everest, writing a book. It's like building a massive pyramid. It feels like that to me anyway. And so that effort didn't feel necessarily worth it. And none of the other ideas came back. I had no new ideas for a long time. And I, it's still hard actually from that point of view. And that's probably about lots of things, my resilience, lots of things that I probably need to work on and get over myself. But I think there's lots of other parts of it that, in our age where there's so much storytelling being thrust at us through Netflix and TV and other books, and there's the whole weight of literary history as well. It's very hard for me sometimes to think of an idea or want to set out on an idea that feels new or interesting or that hasn't already been said. And that's probably the wrong way about thinking about it. And I'm getting better at that. But there was definitely a long tail to the rejection in those terms. I mean, probably what I should have done is just sat down and tried to write something else. But actually, I went off and painted for a year.
Quite a lot of people that you hear about writing rejection from, and a few of the people I'm speaking to, are talking about debuts. So, unpublished first manuscripts in drawers or getting knocked back by agents or editors. And I think there's a huge assumption that once you've made it, and then you don't really need to worry, because you sort of think, well, I've been published. And in your case, I've been published very well and been reviewed well. But clearly I think yours is not an uncommon story either, and it's not an uphill battle, because there's so much joy to be had in it, but it isn't, as you said before, linear.
Yeah, and I think there's other things that you might sort of ask yourself in a position like mine. You might think, well, your first novel was very autobiographical. Does that mean you can only write about yourself? Have you not got it in you to create something completely new? And there's other, I don't know if we want to talk about the market forces, but I do think it's changed out there. I think publishers, for lots of reasons, have had to become a lot more sort of discerning. I was very lucky, and I still am. But I think that there is something about the sort of gatekeepers, and I now run a history festival, and in a sense I become a gatekeeper to say, yes, I want that book, but that book's not good enough for my festival. And you just have to do it because there's an audience, and you've got to do what you think's right for the audience. So it's hard out there. There's lots of people writing books.
Yeah, I basically had a lot of knockbacks on the basis of there being too many similar books out there. My book is sort of comic domestic fiction with a big motherhood drive, and there were just a lot of motherhood books out there, and I got a lot of very, very lovely knockbacks saying, I would publish this if we were like 3 years prior, but can't now, sorry. Which is, it's brutal. Some people might be able to just waltz into the next one, but I couldn't. I was practically catatonic for a month, and then I was like, okay, slowly, I'll sort of get up again, but it's hard.
Oh, it was worse than losing my legs.
Really?
It felt worse. It felt worse than having my legs blown off from a sort of psychological point of view, because it was so personal. It was very about me. Whereas having my legs blown off, although I did slightly blame myself for stepping on the wrong bit of ground, I sort of knew that it was bad luck at the same time. But with the book, it just felt like somebody had said, no thanks, Harry, we don't like you. And I just poured 2 years into it, and it was that. So I found it very hard to take. And in terms of resilience, I'm quite a resilient bloke, but that was tough, and I think still impacts the way I make creative decisions.
Wow, yeah, you're right. I mean, it does feel very personal, even though it's clearly not.
I felt when reviewing my manuscript and trying to start on something else, which is, as you say, I think whatever stage you're at, very hard. If you've experienced rejection, it's very hard to put pen to paper and have confidence in an idea. I felt actually that I hadn't thought enough about the reader, not so much the market, but the reader first time around. So I had put an awful lot of it was fiction, but I had put an awful lot of myself in it, and I was just sort of having fun with words, and that's something I'm thinking about going forward into the next one.
Yeah, I mean, I met a author who said, you've got to know your reader, and he said he wrote for a businessman flying from from London to Tokyo, and in that 8 hours they would read his thriller, and that's who he was trying to entertain. But just going back to the I do think it's a mistake to think too especially when you're starting out, to think too much about who's going to read it and what a publisher wants, and whether there's lots of other books like that out there. But I do think you have to have one eye on the market.
It's a business.
Yeah, it is. And I think not many people can have this luxury, but if you can write a book that, I mean, so the best moment for me of publishing that first book that got published, I had reviews. I was shortlisted for a couple of small prizes. I won a very, very small prize. It was all cool. Yeah, it was wonderful. It was great. But the best moment, and I only know this now, was the moment that I printed it out and it was just mine and it sat on the desk with me and I'd finished it and no one else had read it yet. That's the best moment. And I think if you can sort of even hold on to that, even if you're trying to get it published, I think that can help, because if it's good enough in its own right and what you've achieved, then all the other stuff, it's always going to be important and we always dream. But if you can hold on to that, I think that makes a big difference. And yes. I sort of had to remember that with the second book, that printing it out and having it and having done it was an achievement, even though it never went anywhere. And if it had been published, it would have been completely panned, I'm sure. But but it being in flow and all those things that are wonderful as you're writing and being inside your imagination, those are the things that are great about writing. Actually, not sitting at some dinner because you've been shortlisted for a prize is great fun, but it's not that great fun,
Yeah, it's the writing's got to be enjoyable. What's next, Harry? Because you mentioned a non-fiction book, and obviously you're an artist and you teach art as well.
So yeah, I've been writing. The other thing about books is that they can lead to other things. So Anatomy of a Soldier sort of led to another gig with the Wellcome Collection, who asked me to write a sort of narrative non-fiction about how technology can repair the body. So it's about all sorts of different med tech and how it can augment and replace and create sort of cyborgs and things like that. So it's a sort of non-fiction book where I stomp around meeting scientists and inventors and engineers who are making all the latest prosthetics and gadgets and gizmos that help people repair after they've been injured or they get ill. So that's the book, and I'm just coming to the end of it. I'm into the sort of editing process. But it's also given me a sort of insight to the completely other side of it, where a publisher came to me and said, can you write this book? And I went back and forth proposal, which took about a year actually in the end, to make sure that they were happy with what I was writing. And then I got a year to write it. I obviously missed my deadline for lots of reasons. And then the pandemic came along. And so I'm still, I've still got the job, which is great. And hopefully it'll be published. I think it's chalked down for March 2022. So, these things take time, but I'm just in the rewrite stage, having sort of written about 80,000 words. It's probably a 50, 60,000 word book. So I'm just sort of chopping and changing and rewriting at the moment.
That sounds so interesting. And actually that reminds me that one of my favorite chapters in Anatomy is where Tom gets his first prosthetic and the very sort of minute changes that need to be made to this early piece of equipment. And I think at the end of the chapter that gets left in a corner. And I actually remember feeling sad for the prosthetic because he was going on to better ones. Is that right? If I remember that right?
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
And I thought that was such a wonderful way of, it's a really fascinating and presumably very fast moving world.
It is fast moving, but it's also not as fast moving as parts of it are very fast moving, but it's for instance, it's the sort of miracle cancer cure that you hear about in the paper. And then but it's not going to come along for 10 years time. So in some senses, med tech moves very quickly, but there are lots of parts of it. For instance, that the way we attach prosthetic legs hasn't changed really since the 16th century, really. So there's lots of parts of it, but it's really about how technology changes us as humans. So hopefully in that sense, it won't be the book won't be sort of out of date as soon as it's written.
That sounds fascinating. And will you write fiction again? Are you writing fiction?
Yeah, I am starting to play around with something. But again, it's I'm sort of doing it in a much less sort of, what's the word? I'm sort of I'm trying to think of the right word. I'm sort of putting less energy into it in terms of being much more, I'm keeping it at arm's length from myself because I don't want to get too close to it at the moment.
Yeah.
And I think if it gets to a stage where I think it might be a goer, I'd probably send 30,000 words to my agent, but I know that's the luxury that not many not, very few writers have, especially those who are starting out, on their own without an agent.
Yeah, but I mean, I think you've earned it, and also, you have also experienced. You've experienced, sending thousands of words out and not getting the answer you want. So that's tough to do that all over again.
Yeah, but I think this time I'm definitely going to do it for myself. To start with, it's got to be fun and enjoyable. But it's like all those things. It's like painting. If you turn something you enjoy or a hobby or a passion into your livelihood, it changes. It very much changes how it feels to you, I think, or can do a lot of the time.
How different do writing and art feel to you? Are they similar in the ways that they feel fulfilling?
Yeah, they do. I mean, I feel like I'm accessing a very similar part of the imagination when I do both. Painting's much more physical. So things like sort of flow, if you know what I mean, being in flow and being completely in it, I find much easier with sort of painting and drawing, because you're physically moving the body and you can lose yourself in it, in a way that with writing, which is essentially, in my view, it's a code. We all know the code quite well, but because it's this rigid code, you have to adhere to far more rules. So it's sometimes harder to get into that flow. It's a bit more of a struggle, but for me, it's, in the end, writing is probably more rewarding, because you can essentially create virtual reality, if that makes sense. You can create a world that has every sense in it, and you can completely make someone be in that role. You can sort of insert your imagination into someone else's imagination.
Thank you so much for listening to Write Off. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you do have a chance to leave a review or rating, I'd really appreciate it. You can do that in your podcast app, and it really helps people find the podcast. Plus, it just makes me feel good, to be honest. Guests still to come on the podcast include Julian Fellows, Anne Napolitano, Alex Wheatle, Michelle Roberts, Phoebe Morgan and Douglas Stewart. You can also find me on Twitter. I'm at Francesca Steele with an E at the end. So do pop along and say hello. Hope to see you there. Bye.